Then we come to chapter 15, and this chapter seems to be connected to the fourth commandment to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, because here we have an extension of that Sabbath understanding in relationship to the seventh year remission of debts. Now, this is a fascinating passage because it gives an insight into the heart of God regarding economics. On the one hand, people were encouraged to loan money freely to those who are in need. Also, those people had an obligation to pay that back. Interest, as I've mentioned earlier, was outlawed. It was not, the commercial loan was not something that should happen in Israel. But when that loan was given, it should be paid back, but there was a time when debts should be forgiven, or people should be released from debts. In other words, in the economy of Israel, it wasn't possible, or it shouldn't have been possible, for someone to have a debt burden beyond 7 years. Now, at the introduction to this, we find a couple of things. Firstly, there's the ideal with regards to prosperity in Israel, and that is there will be no one, this is in verse 4 of chapter 15, there will be no one in need among you, because the Lord your God will bless you. And so even as they were obedient to the covenant, God's heart was there would be prosperity across the board for everyone. And that they should be those who were in control. There's a beautiful way of saying it in verse 6, that you will lend to many nations and will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, they will not rule over you. In other words, economically, the country was solid and strong and people were prosperous. But we also have the reality. And the reality is that there would be poor people among them. And we read in verse 11, open your hand to the poor and the needy among your land. And it's in this context that Moses goes into a little bit of preaching, a little bit of exhortation. Verse 7, if there's any among you in need, a member of your community, in any of your towns, and so on and so forth, you shall not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your needy neighbour. You shall rather open your hand and lend willingly to meet your neighbour's need. But there comes a time when this would be forgiven. In other words, debt slavery, even a reality today in some countries, was never to be part of the economy or the social structure of Israel. We do have an interesting addition to this law in verse 12. What we have in verse 12 is actually echoing what we read in the book of the covenant in Exodus chapter 21. It talks there about this debt slavery. Now, the term slavery is, of course, an unfortunate term, because when we say the word slave, it brings up all kinds of images of people owning, controlling, and abusing other people. But here, it seems that isn't the thing that we have in focus, but rather there's an arrangement where if someone was in debt, they would be able to work off that debt, or members of their family would be able to work off that debt. And the point is that working off of the debt would never be longer than 7 years. And when you read the tone of this passage, it's very clear that the expectation is that that person who here is called a slave, or understood to be a slave, the expectation is that they would be treated so well during that set of circumstances that at the end of it, they may even want to remain working for that particular person that they've been with. And there's a whole ceremony here that if they do, then they get connected into that household, and they go and have an ear-piercing ceremony on the doorpost. But the other thing is, if someone is in economic disadvantage and then they need to take 7 years to work off that debt, when they finish that period, they weren't then just released back into poverty, but rather the person they had worked for had to provide them liberally, verse 14, out of their flock, their threshing floor, their winepress, and they had to really set them up as productive members of society. And so we see the combination of things. If we think of the interpretation questions, firstly, the hope that as people are obedient to the covenant, there wouldn't be any need. But in the fallenness of life, there would be need, and if a family has a great need, then others are to lend generously without interest to help them. But that people who've borrowed the money, they have a responsibility to pay that back. So the person who lends it is protected. Their assets are protected. But there is to be no exploitation, whereby those who loan the money end up owning those who had borrowed, and they lose their freedom, they lose their livelihood. But rather there is an arrangement where they would pay it back, and it would be for a limited period of 7 years. And during that time, there is an expectation that these people were treated with dignity and respect, so much so that they may want to stay. And so we see this law that is designed to bring about dignity, and each person be able to be productive members of society. And although we live in a very different situation, surely that is the very best outcome for people. As I look at this law, I'm reminded of a situation of a family in my church a few years ago. This particular brother, he had his own business. He worked actually selling and buying stuff, but selling stuff on eBay. And to his own omission, he got out of control with his credit cards, and he got into a big financial debt. And he recognized that he had done the wrong thing. He had recognized that the fault was his. He wanted to amend it, but he was trapped in debt. And the credit card companies were after him. He owned a house, and there was a threat that he would lose his house and therefore become homeless. He had young children, and so it was a very difficult situation. And so he actually went to the court of law, and I don't remember all of the details, but the judge who was presiding over this recognized, having heard the story, researched it, recognized that if this man lost his house, then there would be a family without any livelihood, a family without anywhere to live. In our situation, they would then become a burden on the state, and they also recognized that the credit card companies could afford this money. And so the ruling was that they, I don't remember all the details, but the outcome was they kept their home, their debts were cleared, and they were able to start again on a good foundation to build a good financial future, which in fact I understand they have done. And so you can see how there's principles here of financial integrity, importance of paying debts, but also of compassion and seeking to help people become financially independent and stable. And so, although these laws would not necessarily be picked up from 3,500 years ago and put on us today. Nonetheless, there's stuff we can learn as we see the expression of the heart of God. Just to say that there are a few more laws here which are related to the Sabbath. You'll notice that the 3 festivals every year are spoken about: the Passover, Pentecost, and Feast of Tabernacles. Again, I want you to notice that one of the repeated verses is that they should rejoice, and also it should be at the place that the Lord your God will choose. I'd like you just to note that. But then we come on to the 5th commandment, which really begins about 16 verse 18, and this is connected to honor your father and mother. Now, the way this is connected is our parents are the first authority figures that we meet in life. And one of the reasons it's important that as parents we teach our children to honor us, show us respect, is because we're teaching them that there are legitimate authority figures that God would place in our lives, in society. And if those authority figures and their authority is undermined, then that could end up bringing about a breakdown of society. Now, of course, we know in many societies authority figures are corrupt and they're out for themselves, and that has repercussions in that nation of poverty and hardship. And so we're aware of all that. But in this context, it seems to me that this foundation of honouring parents becomes that platform of learning to honour authority figures, because in this next section there are 4 authority figure classes that are mentioned. The first is the judges in chapter 16:18, and then kings in 17:14, and then priests in chapter 18:1, and then prophets in 18 verse 9. And each of these are given a space whereby Moses is reminding people of these roles and the fact they should be honoured, respected, and obeyed. So firstly, judges. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 1, judges was mentioned. But now we have this larger portion because, as I said, in any society, the justice system needs to be absolutely honest and have integrity. The justice system needs to be just. And that's what it speaks about here. How in verse chapter 16, verse 18, verse 19, you must not distort justice. You must not show partiality. You must not accept a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the course of those who are right. Justice and only justice you shall pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land. And then we have another one of those little random laws which is connected to idolatry. But that leads into verse 1 of chapter 17. And here it seems that this is a test case, an example of how justice should be worked out. And the case is a typical one. It's one of the worst possible crimes, and that is treason, idolatry. And it talks there that if a man or a woman does evil, and verse 4, and it is reported and you hear about it, the first thing that should happen is that the judge should make a thorough inquiry and to see if the charge is proved true. In other words, in the justice system in Israel, there needed to be what today we would call the detective work. There needed to be that kind of time taken to make sure that the accusation is really true. And if it does prove true, in this particular case, the judgment is an execution. It is a death penalty. And verse 6, on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, the death sentence shall be executed. A person must not be put to death on the evidence of only 1 witness. In other words, in the law court system, they had to be very clear about the guilt of someone before the penalty was executed. And so much so that the witnesses, those who brought testimony against a person, they had to be the first to begin the execution process. And then it talks here in verse 8 about if the decision is too difficult. It's like a court of appeal, that they would go to the place that the Lord their God would choose, which would be the tabernacle and later the temple. And then eventually, of course, the king, when he came, was involved in the justice system as well. And so much more could be said about this, and you can explore that yourself, but just to help you see how this is addressing the important role of the judge. And then 17:14, it's the king. And the king in Israel had to be different than the Canaanite kings. You see, in much of the Canaanite world, the king or the suzerain, they were not under the law, they were the law. They decided what was right and wrong. There was this idea that they were connected to deity. They were the physical manifestation of the national god, and they were the ones who decided what was right and wrong, and they were above the law. But as you read this, you'll realize that that is not the case in Israel. There's a warning against those 3 areas that have so often proved to be fatal in the life of a leader and other people too. Where you'll be familiar with them: money, sex and power. These areas are often at the heart of a failed leadership, and there's a warning here for them. Having many horses talks about an army and therefore military might. Wives that would come in and lead people's hearts astray. And not having lots of silver and gold. And so we see, verse 18, when the king comes to a throne, they are to be given a copy of this law. Now this is remarkable because they don't make the law, they are under the law. And a special word, that they are not to put themselves above the members of the community. This is such a different picture of a king. This is where the king is actually a servant of the people. He too is under the law. He too is responsible for them. He too needs to give account to the way he lives. And so they should not stand aside from the commandment to the right or to the left. And so there's provision here for a king. Now, this didn't happen until many years later, but nonetheless, the leader, the king, when they were to come, was not to be like the kings of the pagan nations. When it comes to priests, there's only a little mentioned, because so much has been mentioned in the book of Leviticus, of course. You have the whole priesthood responsibilities laid out. Some are in Exodus, some in Numbers, especially in Leviticus. Here, it's just a reminder to the people that the priest should receive their allotted portion. If the priests are to do the job, they have to have their pay. No pay, no priests, because to live they would need to go out and farm the land. And so here there's just a brief reminder that the priests should have their particular portion of the sacrifices. With the prophets, you have the negative, then you have the positive. In 18:9, it talks about the prophetic role that was common among the pagan and the Canaanite religious worship. And of course, these are those people that are connected to all manner of witchcraft. And God says that these are to be driven out. They're to have no part in this kind of a prophetic activity. But rather, verse 15, the Lord your God will raise up prophets like me from among your people. You shall heed such a prophet. Now, just as a side note, this phrase, God will raise up a prophet like me from among your own people, in the time of Jesus, this became a very important word because it was a picture of the fact that there would be a prophet, and that prophet became understood to be the Messiah. And so this is why people asked John the Baptist, "Are you the prophet?" And they were actually talking about this particular passage. But as we go on here, it talks about how the prophet should be listened to because God would put his words in their mouth. You remember how at Mount Sinai, when the people heard God speaking audibly, they said, "No, Lord Moses, don't let's do this. You hear God and you speak to us what he says." And that, of course, was the birth of the prophet. And that is what is spoken about here, how the prophet needs to be heeded. And but there's a test. In fact, there's two tests. We saw a test of the prophet in chapter 13. A prophet may work signs and wonders, but if their message is not in keeping with the law, they are not to be listened to. In other words, if they say, worship other gods, then they're not to be listened to. Here, there's a test of, is the prophet true in what he says? If he claims something's going to happen, does it happen? If it doesn't happen, he's not a true prophet. So much could be said about these, all of these passages here, but here we have this category of authority figures that they had to listen to. In chapter 19, we come to a group of laws that are connected to the sixth commandment, and that is, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. Because here we have instructions about the cities of refuge and also about the military. The cities of refuge in chapter 19, one following, this is a fascinating law because it speaks about those who in unfortunate circumstances are involved in the death of someone else, but there was no premeditation, there was no desire, but rather it was a tragic accident. And one thing that would help us to understand is that the whole understanding of the blood feud was really a big deal. If someone in your family was murdered, then you had a responsibility to see that that person was brought to justice. And often it would be you as a family would take the law into your own hands. And this is very common in that time, and it has been in many societies throughout the world at different times, this thing of the blood feud. And so if there was an accident and I accidentally killed someone, we were chopping a tree down, and the axe head flew off and hit them and killed them, then my life would be in great danger. But what was set up were 6 cities, 3 on one side of the Jordan, 3 on the other, and these cities were where people could flee to, and they would be protected in that city. And then there would be the due process of justice that would take place to see whether, in fact, it was an accident or whether it was premeditated. And so it talks here about the various cities of refuge. And then the importance of witnesses in the law court situation, because if people bring a false witness, then people could be executed wrongly, and you bearing false witness is actually you becoming a murderer. Because if it was a capital case, they would be executed. You had brought a false witness, and then they were executed because of it. And again, it speaks about how there should be 2 or 3 witnesses. And it speaks about the judge, verse 18, making a thorough inquiry. And if you, as a false witness, were proved to be false, then the consequence of that is that your judgment, your penalty was what this innocent person would have received had your testimony been believed. And so there's a law there speaking again about the importance of the justice system. Chapter 20, we have what today we would call rules of engagement. Now, there's 2 separate ones here. Firstly, there's how they should handle the nations in the land that they are going to possess. And as you've read often, they were God's means of judgment on those people. And so it first speaks about them, but then verse 10 following, it talks about the nations who are far away. Now, we know in a perfect world there wouldn't be war. We know that Jesus in Isaiah is known as the Prince of Peace. We have in Isaiah that hope when there will be a time when swords and implements of war will be beaten into farming implements. And so there's this hope of a peaceful future. But as I said in a previous session, we're living in a fallen, broken world, and the law is often not the ideal, but rather it's recognizing there's a brokenness. And Israel, as they moved into their promised land, they would be surrounded by warfaring peoples. The Ammonites, the Moabites, the Syrians, the Philistines, the Egyptians. These different nations at different times had designs on the country, and they wanted to attack and to conquer. And here we see that God is saying to Israel, when you go into your land, you have a responsibility to defend your borders. If you are obedient to my covenant, then I will be a protection for you. But if you disobey me, then that protection will be lifted, and you will become at the mercy of your neighbours. But in this particular law, what you see is that when it comes to defence, firstly, Israel was never to become an empire-building nation. In other words, they were not to be attacking the nations around simply to destroy them and take what they have. Because God set the boundaries. And that is something that was spoken to Abraham, and it was, you come to Joshua, you see that. The boundaries of the land were set. It was never that Israel should be conquering other lands. And as we look in history, so much war is simply because someone, a political figure in one country decides they want to take other lands that don't belong to them. So much war is through that. But that should never be the case for Israel. But Israel was to defend its borders. And as you read this, you'll notice that first of all, verse 10, they were to go and offer the town or the city terms of peace. So in other words, if they begin to be threatened by a neighbouring city-state, they were to take their army and they were to offer that city terms of peace. In other words, they were not to start the fight, but if someone else started it, they were to finish it, and they were to finish it swiftly. And so they offered it terms of peace, but the terms of peace were in the sense of they would become suzerains, and that city would become a vassal. And that is why it says here that if they surrender, they shall serve you with forced labor. In other words, they will be a vassal, and then they will be required to pay tribute. So you don't start the fight, but if it is, you take initiative. You don't sit back and wait. You take initiative. You take your army to that threat, and you deal with it in that way. If they do not submit to you peacefully, then you besiege it. And when the Lord gives it into your hand, you shall put all the males to the sword. Now, the reason for this, of course, is they were to destroy the threat against them. And when it says all the males to the sword, it's talking about the army. What happens is that they would siege the city, and when it fell, they would destroy the army. And by destroying the army, then you no longer have that city is no longer a threat to you. And as a nation, they will be able to rest and relax. And so there's more instructions about how the siege should happen and what they should and what they shouldn't do. In chapter 21, it's still this same theme connected to do not murder, because there's instructions there about how to handle the situation if someone was found dead, murdered, and no one knew who did it. And so again, this just speaks about the value given to human life. Because if someone was found dead, that mattered. If they didn't know who the person was or who did it, it still mattered. And there was a whole ceremony that the elders of the nearest town needed to go through to try and find out all they can, to try and find out what happened. But then, if not, there is a ceremony. Here in England at the King's Lodge, just a while back, we had a tragic motor accident right at our gate, and a young man died in the accident. He wasn't connected to us in any way, simply a passerby, but it was, of course, a great tragedy. And I was intrigued because of this death, the law says there has to be an inquest. And I went to the court to sit in and learn all I can about this situation because it was so local to us. And what fascinated me was the amount of time and money and energy and effort that was put in to find out why this young man died. It was not a court to find blame. There's no one being sued. It was simply an inquest, an inquiry to discover what actually went on. And there were expert witnesses from the police and the traffic accident unit, and there were witnesses that were there who were around, and they all brought testimony, and then a conclusion was brought. And I was reflecting on just where did this idea come from? Why is it that so much effort is put in to this situation? And in so many parts of the world, tragically, people die, and there's nothing done. Maybe they're buried, or there doesn't seem to be any concern. Death is something that is so prevalent so often. Yet in the society that has a Bible at the roots, even if it's not read as much as it should be today, nonetheless we see that there's a value put on human life. And surely this comes from that sixth commandment, you shall not murder. And here we see in the ancient biblical times, there was this value put on human life, and if death was found, there had to be this inquiry and this ceremony. We come to 21, verse 10. Now this is another strange law to many of us. It's about when if you go to war and you take your enemies, and there's a beautiful woman and you desire to marry that woman, then there's a ceremony of what should happen. She would shave her hair and be given a month to mourn her father and mother, and then you should marry her. If you're not satisfied with her, she shall be set free, and you must not treat her as a slave. And we read that with our modern sensibilities, and it seems very strange to us, maybe a bit harsh or even cruel. We can have different reactions to it, but that is because we bring our modern sensibilities to it. If we go back to so much of history, the truth is when there's warfare and one army defeats another army and a city, what happens is absolutely awful. Today we would call it crimes against humanity, but it has been normal all the way through history. The army would come in, the soldiers would go into the town, they would rape the women. That was very normal. They would slaughter them, they would smash children and babies, they would rip open pregnant women, they would take, of course, all of the plunder, and the cruelty and the atrocities would be enormous, but it was normal. I think we need to understand that this has been throughout history normal activity. Today we live post-Geneva Convention. Today, because of Henry Dumont, this believer there in Switzerland who came across a battlefield just after the battle had ended. He was traveling from one city to another, saw the agony of the wounded just being left there to die. It was he who was instrumental in 1859 to bring about the Red Cross as an organization to be active in such circumstances, but also the Geneva Convention. And the Geneva Convention makes a distinction between combatants and civilians, and the way that these are treated differently. Civilians should be protected. Combatants, of course, army, were part of the fight. But this is modern in history. All the way throughout history, and even in places today, these sensibilities are nowhere on the battlefield, and certainly not for a victorious army when they would come in and attack and plunder a people. And so it's in the light of that we find this particular law. And here we find rather Israel is not permitted to go in and to rape the women, but rather if there's a woman that they would like to have sexual relationships with, then they were to marry them. This is amazing stuff. And again, it speaks about the dignity and an impossible situation of battle and defeat and all of this awfulness. Here we find this statement of humanity, that rather than rape and then murder, they are to take this woman and give her space and dignity to mourn, and then to enter into a new life. And then, if that doesn't work, rather than treat her as a slave, to be setting her free. And so again, this is talking about a specific situation, but as is so often with these laws, they are case law. I haven't mentioned this, and maybe you've heard this in other teachings on the Torah. But what we have here are not, like today, thousands and thousands and thousands of laws. In many of our countries, who can know all the laws? There's so many. You have to specialize into different kinds of law. But in the Torah, what we have is probably what is better termed as case law, whereby there's examples given. And it's out of those examples we find values and principles and and the way these values then would be applied would be out of those principles into many different situations and circumstances. And so we come to a few more different laws, and what I find in the particular scheme that we have here is the neatness of the different topics do seem to break down a little. But now we come to chapter 22, verse 9. We've already looked at some of these laws in chapter 22, but in this particular scheme, in chapter 22, verse 9, it then begins to talk about the areas of adultery.